I think being a Palestinian informs a lot of your work of how you understand the world, in the sense that you always need to think strategically. How do you tell a story without repeating, say, documentary style reflections of what's going on? So you have this onus of kind of trying to step outside yourself to really understand what kind of people from outside that situation need to hear. My name is Larissa Sansour. I'm a visual artist. I started working with film in 2003, although my education was really more into painting and sculpture. I think my introduction into film very much was informed by reacting to what was happening in Palestine and wanting to address the political content there.
My name is Søren Lind. I have a background in philosophy. I am an artist, but I also write. Larissa and I started working together 15 years ago when I got involved in essentially her practice by providing the manuscripts for the films that we then started doing together. And now we co-direct as well. But we also do work in sculpture, installation, and photography occasionally.
In the beginning, my work was more kind of documentary style, so I would just kind of focus on what was really happening in Palestine. I felt that my issue with how things were documented about Palestine started from when we used to live in New York and seeing the discrepancy between what was happening on the news and what I was actually hearing from friends and family. But then my work kind of evolved into becoming more fictional, or maybe trying to address what is real and what is fiction. And seeing Søren's background in philosophy and writing, Søren started getting involved in also the storytelling aspect of those films.
So the development has been from early documentary to science fiction mainly.
I think setting your whole world in, say, a sci-fi universe, you are more able to discuss things in depth without kind of being framed in that whole dialogue of how you're supposed to really be talking about that place. And I think the idea that you are constantly kind of projecting a future sat very well with the Palestinian psyche that seems to have been stuck since 1948 with the Palestinian, exodus, with the Nakba, when a lot of Palestinians basically fled Palestine.
So sci-fi kind of became our refuge, where we could take with us some of these more speculative topics that fall between the cracks. And maybe adding to that one of the reasons why we always go for the high production value and the sci-fi is that we want to hyper-legitimize the debate being had in our film, in a sense, by associating it with a more mainstream format.
I think it flips the balance between the analyzer and the analyzed, whereas in a documentary, say, if you take it, if you're the subject of that documentary, you're the one being analyzed, whereas kind of working with sci-fi or fiction, you kind of take on the role of that you are part of this world and you are speaking the same language. And so you flip the roles and the power balance, which is probably one of the main points that are made in our films.
the main topics of our last projects. That's been a combination of genetics and inherited trauma and loss.
Yeah, I think that is a thread that we're talking about epigenetics. We're also talking about proleptic mourning, where you kind of foresee disaster before it happens. But it's kind of part of this cyclicality of the Palestinian psyche and trauma. And so I think the future there is always, I think, also part of science fiction, where you're constantly talking about a future as though you already know that it happened, but it's still something you're waiting for.
And I think you're right, the cyclicality, the perpetual sort of erasure, the non-existence, the non-sort of agency of the Palestinian, with no end in sight to alter this particular tragic condition. So yes, also tomorrow there will be, invisibility. You will be attempted forced out of history, as it were. Well, in vitro is technically a generational debate. 30 years after an eco-disaster has rendered Bethlehem uninhabitable, a group of scientists are about to re-inhabit town. And in the 30 years they've been away, they've been hiding in an underground bunker where they've been cultivating local crops ready to replant the soil above, and they've also been cultivating a new generation of clones based on the remnants of those that passed away 30 years ago. Just before this sort of transfer from underground to above happens, the founder of this particular orchard and these experiments is about to pass away. She's ill and she's bedridden, and she gets visited by the younger person who's about to take over and lead the transfer to the soil above, and they have a discussion about memory, about how to forge a future. Should it be forged in the image of the past, or should you have a clean slate so that you can start anew so as to not make the same mistakes as you already committed?
الماضي لساته هون سليم زي ما كان دايما. يمكن الماضي تبعك. أنا كل إشي بعرفه وكل الماضي تبعي هون. كل إشي تاني هو قصص خيالية.
I think it's also very much a film about the diaspora of people growing up in a place that's outside of their origin, and hence is the name of in vitro, developing outside the womb, and the clones basically were born in that underground space and have never seen the face of the earth, and so they only understand the earth by stories of their parents and the elders in that compound, and they grow quite resentful of the fact that for their elders this is not a real space. And then kind of we delve into this idea of what is real and what's not, where the clones think that the exile is really their elders' exile, because really all they know is that underground space, and they don't resent the fact to think that this is nothing but like a corridor where they are then meant to go back to where they belonged.
Although in vitro is inspired by the idea of crisis, and although the topics discussed relate to historical crises as well, the work is not about crisis per se, but as crisis as a way of eradicating, giving room and place to a new dialogue, for a new dialogue to arise. So it's the tabula rasa aspect of crisis that is central to the setup for in vitro. It's almost like, in vitro to a certain extent represents how we work within sci-fi, namely by leaving the past behind so that we can see what follows through, what does not vanish with the present, what continues to become important. And for us, it was this idea of this eternal question in the Palestinian situation, how to forge a future, how to develop beyond the rubble.
Or the idea, I guess, of if that rupture didn't happen, what if you're talking about a homogeneous history, what kind of identity would Palestinian identity be? Or is Palestinian identity tied to the fact that it is cemented in resistance and trauma? You see the current political crisis in Israel and Palestine set against the backdrop of an environmental disaster. That was quite important for us because it was kind of a way to understand how we as humans identify with nations and the idea of us set against another. And at a time when there are more pressing, the annihilation of humanity is right around the corner. So it's kind of framing it in that context also allowed us to talk about, what is personal memory compared to, say, collective memory, state memory, and then planetary memory. So it was kind of tried to deal with all these in relation to one another in order to kind of maybe accentuate each particular element in that setup. As if no misfortune had occurred in the night, we came up with the concept because we got invited to work with some geneticists, and for a new commission, we got very excited about how epigenetics work, and we thought it kind of really worked very well with what we were doing.
So what attracted us to the idea of epigenetics is the thought that rather than only passing on traumas on an oral history note, some of this material, simply the imprint in your genetic material, also transfers eventually to your offspring and to future generations. So even if we all stay silent about what happened to us or our people or whoever, the trauma experienced actually is manifest somehow in the material that you pass on to the future generations.
And in the end, we had this eureka moment where we thought, why not combine the genetics research that we were doing with an opera? So we started with this opera, and we again wanted to combine a European tradition of music with Palestinian music tradition. So it's a combination of Mahler's Kindertotenlieder and a Palestinian folk song called Al-Auf, because it's a piece about mourning, about a mother losing a child, if you take it from Mahler's perspective. And then the Palestinian folklore song is about, having your kids drafted into the army. So it kind of combined in that way. And it was written during World War I, and it's a mourning of all the kids that had to be drafted in the Ottoman Empire's army to fight a war that's not even theirs.
I think just to say about our composer, Anthony, what a dramatic task he had to perform. One thing is that you have two scores, but the ambition was to fuse them along the way so that it becomes difficult to sort of differentiate between them. One becomes the other. and eventually fuse the two together to the point of not knowing when you're in whose hands.
But I think conceptually also that we wanted to set it in a context that's more universal. So it's kind of maybe attempts to talk about the Palestinian predicament as something that is a universal concern. So it's not just, you know, a local problem. So in that sense, using a European kind of musical tradition with the Palestinian musical tradition made sense. It's very much a language piece as well. It is a language that kind of oscillates between proper Arabic and spoken Arabic. And understanding who's going to really perform the opera was another big kind of endeavor, because we needed to find a Palestinian who would perform it with a Palestinian accent. But we finally found Noor, who is from Nazareth, and it was just amazing to work with her. Kind of the main part of the film is that she sings, and in the end she walks down into a pool and immerses herself, and the pool is full of indigo colored water, and then she comes out in that color. The film until that point is black and white. So that the challenge of filming that water was the main thing, because getting the water to look exactly blue took us so many tries. We at some point had to completely empty the swimming pool and then fill it up again and try different blues. It was also built from scratch in the abandoned cathedral where we were at, so it was an undertaking. It wasn't just a swimming pool that was just there. We wanted it to have this cathedral-like environment. But the significance of the blue and why we really needed to film it in blue is that I found out while working on this piece that 100 years back, Palestinians, when they mourned, they didn't wear black as they do now, but actually dyed the best clothes indigo, because the indigo color, unlike other dyes, doesn't come off with wash, so it doesn't ever get worn out. The only way to get rid of it is to like scrape it. So it kind of worked really well with our concept of trauma and how you cannot get rid of it. It stays on for generations.
ليش اخترتي علم الآثار كساحة المعركة؟
هاي كانت واحدة من الجبهات من الأساس اللي حكمونا بنوا هويتهم معتمدين على الآثار. ما عاد في لزوم للتاريخ. هاي هي أداة التعريف اللي اختاروها عشان يخلقوا وهم متجانس. Archaeology in absentia is related to a film that we did earlier called In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain. And in the film, we follow a rebel who calls herself a narrative terrorist, who is set to change the narrative of what we then later find out, the narrative of the Palestine-Israel history. In the film, this rebel leader tries to bury a lot of porcelain plates in various parts of Israel and Palestine. And so her idea is that she's burying all these plates in order for future archaeologists to find.
This rebel leader in the film version of Archaeology in Absentia plants archaeological evidence in the ground for future archaeologists to excavate. And the idea behind that is that she wants to ensure that the present historical understanding or the present narratives are jumbled up and therefore political power differently distributed in the future with some kind of justice for her own people to follow. So it's out of her own hands in the sense that she is not hoping for this to happen in her own lifetime, but she wants to plant the seeds for a complete revision of history as we know it. In Israel-Palestine, archaeology is weaponized to the point of saying, well, if we do find, like, all human rights and ownership in present day aside, if we do find a pot here that indicates that we were here 3,000 years ago, then lo and behold, this is probably mine then, isn't it? So we thought, well, on that note, let's reclaim what's archaeology has supported, you know, and handed over to the counterpart. And therefore we produced an awful lot of porcelain with sort of Palestinian resistance patterns on it. And I went in collaboration with a lot of art institutions and made 15 different plants of porcelain in various places. And then we have registered all the coordinates of these deposits on small discs that we then have situated within the bronze sculptures that we made a series of 15 of them, each representing a remote deposit of porcelain in Israel-Palestine.
So the Fabergé-like eggs that you see in the show carry those coordinates in them, and they have been modeled around an old Russian nuclear bomb.
And the idea is to somehow reverse the artifact museum relation by saying that, well, you now, as exhibitors of this particular sort of representative of this remote deposit of crockery or porcelain, become the remote protector of this deposit. So the archaeology itself, the artifacts themselves, are absent from the installation, but you have a reference point to where they are, and you now guard this with your institution.